Guest today for the new release feature author for April on the Rights for Women Convo Couch is Meredith Jaffé. Meredith is the author of 3 novels for adults, The Fence, The Making of Christina, and The Dressmakers of Yarrandarrah Prison, her new release. Horse Warrior, the first in a children's series, was published in 2019. She also contributed a short story, Emergency Undies, to the 2019 Funny Bones anthology. Meredith is the Festival Director of StoryFest, held on the New South Wales South Coast, and regularly facilitates at other writers' festivals and author events. Previously, she wrote the weekly literary column for the online women's magazine, The Hoopla. Her feature articles, reviews, and opinion pieces have also appeared in The Guardian Australia, The Huffington Post, and Mamamia. Meredith became a writer via the scenic route, she likes to say, which I'll be asking her about today. Her new novel, The Dressmakers of Yarrandarrah Prison, is a funny, dark, and moving novel about finding humanity, friendship, and redemption in unexpected places. And Meredith is here to tell us all about it as our new release feature author for this month. Meredith, welcome to the Rights for Women Convo Couch.
And lovely to be here, Pamela. At last, I can be on this side of the screen and not listening.
That's right, because you spend quite a bit of your professional life doing facilitating, and we're going to get on to talking about that later. But of course, right now you're in the thick of your book's about to come out. I know you're working on your next novel. So just for anybody who's listening, we've done a little bit in the intro, but can you talk about this scenic route that you took to becoming a writer?
In some ways, sometimes I wish I didn't. I have to be honest, but sometimes I'm really glad I did. So, it's like most things in life, it's a double-edged sword. So I was a kid who wrote. I wrote terrible poetry as a teen. I wrote lots of short stories I loved. I remember back in the day when you used to have to do creative writing as part of the school certificate. So I loved all that kind of stuff. But was a kid who finished school and had no idea what she wanted to be when she grew up. I went to university because I didn't really know what else to do, and I did an arts degree because I didn't know what to do, and I finished the arts degree and I was like, I'm going to be a writer, and my parents are like, don't be so stupid, get a real job. And because I was a good girl, like a lot of only children, I went, oh, okay. So I did, and I fell into the superannuation industry right at the time when it was becoming an industry rather than just a product. And I actually really enjoyed it. I spent 10 years doing that, learned some great admin skills, which, do pay off in the end. And then I moved into recruiting, and I did that. So superannuation recruiting, funds management recruiting, and I did that for about 15 years. So I guess you could say that I honed my interview skills during that time, which paid off with the facilitating type work. But I also, I'd have to say that my favourite part of recruiting was finding out people's stories and gathering their stories and putting their life together as a narrative rather than, well, first I worked at such and such and then I worked at so and so. I really liked building the story of that, and I guess I should have been listening to myself a bit more, shouldn't I? And then when I was having my third child, our fourth child combined, and my third child, it was right at the time when the GFC hit, and I was running my own headhunting business in financial services. It didn't look pretty, and for once in my life, I went, you know what? I think I might just close my little business down. I think I was like 7 months pregnant. I'll just take some time out, and we'll just see what this looks like on the other side. And as we all know, it was pretty ugly. But weirdly enough too, considering I had one child doing the HSC, another teenager in high school, a 22-month-old and a newborn, I was really worried about what I was going to do with my day. I think more from the point of view, in all fairness to me, that the boredom of having kids, that sounds so bad, but kids will keep you really, really busy, and they are great and fun and engaging, but it's not mentally stimulating if you come from a place where you're constantly using your mind. Just that probably sounds a bit better.
Yeah, no, I think there's a lot of listeners that can relate, and I certainly can. Yeah.
We love them to pieces, but especially when you've read the same book 5 times. So I decided to write a book, and then as I was writing the first draft of that book, absolutely no idea what I was doing, by the way. Didn't even have any how to write a books. so just kind of writing the story that I had in my head. And we know Wendy Harmer and her husband Brendan, and we had them over for lunch. Wine was involved, clearly, because I said, oh, I'm writing a book, like, how dumb was that? And so I'm like, and she was like, oh yeah, and practically did the eye roll. And in fact, if you ask me, I think she did do the eye roll. She still says she did. And she said, oh, well, why don't you show me the first 2,000 words? And I'll tell you if you should bother to continue. And I do remember the bother, right? But, I'm oblivious. I go, okay. And so I handed the 2,000 words, and she comes back and goes, actually, just keep writing. So that was my first sort of validation that, that I might be going somewhere with this. But I think the most important thing about that little story is Wendy had seen my writing. Then fast forward, I don't know, a few months, I can't remember exactly, she came back to me and said, oh, we're thinking about starting this online women's magazine. Would you be interested in working for us? And I was like, yes. And it's the best decision I ever made. That the Hoopla, as we all know, was around for 4 years. It began, I think we floated, but it came out in sort of 2011. Originally, I was just writing opinion pieces, and then about 6 months into that, they asked if I would do the books column. And that was a game changer, because not only are you reading within a structured environment week in, week out, which is what you do with the podcast, and it really keeps you very disciplined about your reading. But it also, as you would also know from the podcast, it makes you read really critically, because if you did love a book, you've got to figure out why you loved it. And if you hated a book, you've got to figure out why you hated it. And if you're kind of sitting on the fence about it, you've got to figure that out as well. And produce the words around that in a weekly column for readers. So that discipline, in terms of understanding the sort of journalistic hierarchy of information, writing to deadline every week, being edited, sometimes brutally, all those kind of things come into play, so that when you sit down to do your own work, creative, write a blog, whatever that thing is, the blank page holds absolutely no fear for me whatsoever. It's just a project that hasn't happened yet. And, you do learn about writing your way into a scene. You do realise about editing yourself ruthlessly. If you don't, someone else will, kind of thing. So that's kind of how I ended up with writing. And that was sort of sad in a way that around the same time that the Hoopla was finishing up in 2014, 15, was that was, I mean, it was sad that it was finishing up, but at the same time, that was around the time I got my first book contract with my first 2 books. So that's the scenic route.
Yeah. Well, I've known you for a while, Meredith, and there's some news in there for me. So it's great to actually find out a few more details about how you got to be where you are. And of course, you had prior to this new book that's come out, you've had 2 adult novels published, The Fence and the Making of Christina, and then The Horse Warrior, which was something completely different, first in a series for children. How do you see this new book sort of fitting into that, whole workspace that you've created so far?
I think it's interesting because The Fence is a satire and The Making of Christina is a drama. And I think what I've learned through writing is you've got to enjoy the writing process. It's not just the story, but as you know, as a writer, you're so immersed in the character's world, in the character's world. And what I discovered is that being in Christina's world, which in her case, in that book's case, was like a 9-year, that was the very first book I was writing that Wendy said, keep going, but it was the second one published. The 9 years I spent with that character was 9 years I'll never get back, in the sense that, she had a really difficult life and problem to resolve in that novel. So I really wanted to start to write novels that were more feel good and more happy places to go and visit on a daily basis and spend, a year, 2, whatever, with the characters. So I guess I learnt that from the writing. And I really enjoyed writing Horse Warrior for kids because it's a lot shorter. So 50,000 words feels like a doddle after 100,000 words. But equally, it also really allowed me to have fun and to not be silly, it isn't as in ridiculous silly, but anything goes. You have to make it you have to do the world building in such a way that everything has its own veracity, but equally you can make a mushroom talk, you can make a rock walk, you can do whatever you damn well please, as long as it fits the context of the world that you've created. And I think that is a really valuable tool, or really valuable lesson that I took out of writing Horse Warrior. And in between all of that too, I also did a short story for the Funny Bones anthology. So that was also a really great exercise in just like in silliness, but still using comedy as a way of really underscoring important points. And I think all of that comes together in the Dressmakers.
Yeah, I would totally agree, having read an early copy of it and loved it. And I've just finished reading the final version, and it's fantastic. But could you tell listeners what it's about, the Dressmakers?
I actually really like my publisher's pitch. This is how she pitched it to the acquisitions meeting as well. She said it was the full Monty meets Orange is the New Black.
That's great.
And the full Monty in the sense that it's an ensemble piece, as you know, and the Orange is the New Black because it's set in a prison environment. I've never seen Orange is the New Black, so I just take the word that that's a really great, brilliant drama, and that therefore the association is really valid. But so the Dressmakers is about a group of prisoners who are in a fictitious jail that I created, Yarrandarrah. And Derek, who's the main character, has been there for some time. He's in jail because he embezzled funds from his local golf club to fund his poker machine addiction, and he doesn't really consider himself an addict, or that his crime is all that bad because he didn't kill anyone. And he's estranged from his family. They've had nothing to do with him since he's been to jail. His one sort of highlight of his week is the sewing group. So Connecting Threads, the charity, runs a sewing group called the Backtackers, and he goes to sewing every week, and he does tapestry and needlepoint and makes cushions and things like that. But he's a bit of a loner. So that's kind of the main thread where the Dressmakers element comes into it. And then around Derek are other characters like the Doc, who's the prisoner librarian, and a new guy who comes into the jail called Joey Maloney. So it's about the journey about how these men all come together, I guess, and about never giving up hope. It's about, some of it's just about basically just having a laugh. Yeah. I mean, I'm not going to deny that. Yeah, it's just a feel-good story. It just happens to be set in a world that hopefully for most of us, we don't know.
Yeah, which brings me to my next question, Meredith. Where did you get the initial idea for the story? This idea of having a story set in a men's prison.
I know, somewhere I know nothing about. So I was, back when I was at the Hoopla, so this shows that I wasn't doing a random, let's talk about the Hoopla. So when I was at the Hoopla, I used to interview writers all the time, and this particular time I was preparing to interview Esther Freud, and the book at that time was Mr. Mac and Me, which is a great little book. And she's also known, Kinky Boots, I think it was her, was it? She wrote that book that became the film, right, about her crazy family. Yeah. I could be wrong about the title, but I think that was it. And she also did a lot of freelance journalism for The Guardian. And this particular piece, so I don't know, when you research people, I just dive into the internet and go fishing and see what I find. And I found this article she'd written about a group called Find Cell Work. And Find Cell Work is a charity, and they go into prisons in Britain and they teach men, because it is predominantly men like Australia, 93% of the prison population there, and I think it's 93, 94 here as well, are male. So they go into prisons, and it's not just necessarily minimum security. It could be maximum security as well. And the volunteers teach these men how to do fine needlework and quilting. And I thought, what? Wow. And you're looking at the beautiful tapestry cushions and this beautiful quilt. And I should also mention another author is Tracy Chevalier, and she's quite highly engaged with them as well now. Like both her and Esther Freud are now patrons of Find Cell Work. They weren't at this particular point in time. And Tracy worked with them on the book about the sleep quilt, which hangs in the Victoria and Albert Museum in the UK. But I saw this article about that Esther had written about Find Cell Work, and my immediate reaction was, wow, imagine if you're a guy in prison who wanted to make his daughter's wedding dress. I have no idea where that thought came from, because they don't make wedding dresses in jail. They don't make any dresses. They make in the manufacturing part they might make hospital scrubs, but in the sort of fine cell work area it's all tapestry, cushions, needlepoint, quilting. But that was the idea, and I wouldn't go away. And then my husband's like, I said, oh, I've got this amazing idea for a book. And he's like, oh, yeah. And I told him, he went, that's really stupid. And I was like, come on, it's a great idea. Men in prison making a dress. He said, how would they physically make a dress? For a start, how would they know what size she was? How would they measure her? And I just sat there and I thought, I'll show you. And so all those kind of questions, if you've read the book, you'll know, are kind of addressed, the practical problems that confront them. And then, of course, because I had that issue about how to make the dress in prison, I then had to create a character who would be able to carry the men forward. And that's predominantly Joey Maloney, and, of course, facilitated by Jane, the sewing teacher. So did I answer the question? I've kind of gone,
no,
you
definitely did.
Esther Freud. So, that's where it all came from.
Okay, so we have Paul to thank for some of that, that.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, I'll show you.
Being the naysayer in the room.
And once you got that idea, Meredith, and because I think that's a fabulous idea, like with fiction, of course, anything that's got that sense of friction or tension, is automatically going to give you something to start with, something to really grab onto. And that whole idea that, well, they can't make a wedding dress in prison. Well, let's see if they can. But did you have to then go about, I'm guessing, doing a fair bit of research on, prison life itself and how, a sewing group, for instance, would operate within the prison system and all that sort of thing? What was your research process like for all that?
Well, my first go-to point was fine cell work itself. And if anyone's interested, I do urge you to go and jump on their website. They have the blog system, so blogs from the prisoners, and they have letters from the prisoners about how the sewing has affected their lives, both inside in the sense of filling time, but also inside in terms of improving their mental health and their sense of well-being, as well as outside the prison once they leave the system. So there was a lot of information that I found there. And then it's just, I guess, every time I hit a point in the story where I wondered whether that would be true. So, for instance, what you have for breakfast is mandated in a prison system. So you have to go look and go, well, what do you have for breakfast? And the thing that makes it slightly tricky is that in Australia, every state runs, like education, the states run corrective services. And so there are variations on the theme of how they might address certain issues. But also within the prison system itself, not all prisons are created equal. And by that I mean, there could be a prison that has its own dairy. There could be a prison that has its own vegetable gardens. So they're not necessarily all reliant on food coming in from, as it were, the Coles warehouse and being schlepped in. Sometimes they are actually actively involved in growing the food or prepping the food as well. And I must say that in my research, our system in Australia seemed quite positively, a much more positive experience than it did seem to be in the UK. So there was that kind of thing, but even down to what toiletries are they allowed? I just assumed they wouldn't be allowed to have a razor. I mean, we'd all be assuming that, wouldn't we? But they've got to shave. So they do have safety razors and stuff like that. So yeah, really, really down to the detail, as well as, prison is a highly structured environment. So knowing how that day unfolds, and their day is nothing like our day. I mean, they're in lockdown most of their day. So, where we might decide we want to go to bed at 9 o'clock at night or 10 or whatever, that decision's not yours to make. So it's also about, it's really what I'm saying is it's world building. So you have to really have to go into this environment and create the universe in which this story could operate, and constantly fact checking yourself, because it would never work as a story if it wasn't authentic. And so I had to be really, really careful that I didn't let the story override the reality, and I wasn't trying to make prison seem like a glossy version, the Vaseline on the screen version of prison. I was actually trying to still keep it grounded in what life would be like for those men.
Yeah, well, you've mentioned Derek, of course, who is the main character, and it's his daughter who they're creating the wedding dress for. And, you know, there's lots of antics that come from that particular practice. But who are some of the other men in the prison with Derek? Because he is quite, as you say, he's quite an introvert in the prison. He doesn't really think he is a criminal, but he is in with a group of pretty hardened criminals, isn't he? And it's a really interesting mix of personalities and just seeing that sense that, you know, there's often that little edge to the group, you know, that you, that at any moment, despite the camaraderie and the fun stuff that's going on, you do a great job of having that sense of, you know, at any moment something could explode here.
So I think it's really important to understand that the novel is set in one wing of a prison. So what I've learned through talking to people who work in the system and stuff is like, well, what we think of as a prison, say for instance, I don't know, Long Bay, is actually a whole lot of prisons within that prison. So there's sort of like pods, if you like, within the prison. So the other thing that's really important is that, my novel is set in one pod, if you like, C wing of a much larger prison. The other thing that's really important to understand is that the way prisoners are categorised, they work their way through, part of the incentive and privilege scheme is that they can work their way from, you know, hardcore maximum security through to day release. Because without that incentive, you've got, you know, you need the carrot and the stick to get people to behave in the ways that you want to do. So the novel is set in C wing deliberately because that's a minimal security wing. So there's stuff that happens in that wing that wouldn't necessarily happen in B wing or A wing or, you know, that kind of equivalent. Yeah. So it's important to understand that I've given myself a break and made it, you know, a little bit more accommodating for the sort of things that I want to do. In that wing is a guy, so that's why you've got this real mix of prisoners. I think it's really important to understand that you wouldn't necessarily be rubbing shoulders with people who've got multiple life sentences if you were in maximum security. So the doc, who's the prisoner librarian, he's in for murdering little old ladies in their beds. His big passion is books. He runs the library, he runs a book club out of the library, he runs the journal writing course, he helps men who are illiterate or functionally illiterate write letters to their lawyers or families or children. And that's a really big issue in the real world, that literacy and functional literacy are very high rates amongst prisoner populations. A large percentage of them have not gone to school past year 9. And even so, they have not necessarily been at school up until year 9, if you know what I mean.
Yeah.
So the doc's a great character. He's a murderer. He's not a particularly nice person, and he's got Derek's number down pat. So he gives Derek a really hard time. But then he's a bit of a psycho as well, because he'll be absolutely cutting and devastating 1 minute, and the next minute he rocks up in Derek's cell with a Scrabble board under his arm and, you know, challenges him to a game of Scrabble. So the Scrabble becomes a motif in the novel for that sort of what would be a violent expression in another relationship. With Derek and the doc, it's over the Scrabble board. So Derek's best friend is Parker. He's a very old prisoner. In fact, you know, I guess in one sense, his job in the novel is to talk about what happens to people who are aging in the prison system and how prisons are not designed to be nursing homes or retirement villages. And that causes real problems, because if you've got old men who have probably had health issues their entire life, poor education, poor opportunities, who then get dementia in a prison situation or develop, you know, really major health issues, it falls to the guards to have to look after them, and that's become a really big issue in prison. So I really wanted to talk about that a little bit with Parker, but he's also a great comedian. He's a really good foil for Derek, because he's got Derek's number, and he just like basically encourages Derek's self. Derek's always telling himself stories really about, you know, how nothing's ever Derek's fault. But anyway, and then into the jail comes a new guy, Joey Maloney. He's actually at the end of his sentence. He's a young guy. You don't find out to the end of the novel what he actually did, and he is he's a real larrikin on the outside. He's always got a joke. He's always ribbing people and carrying on. But I think the thing I like about Joey is, as the novel progresses, you slowly see the other side of this character and what he's really like. So they're kind of the main men in the prison.
Yeah.
And I probably should mention there is the guard that Derek calls young Carl, who likes to believe in the better side of the men and likes to try and keep, he likes to smooth oil on troubled waters. He doesn't want a hard day at work, but he's also he used to be a chef, so there's a bit of a running gag about food that runs through the book as well. So that's kind of the main internal prison kind of world. The good guys, shall we say, in the prison environment.
Yeah, for sure. And were you conscious, Meredith, as you were writing and creating these characters? And, we do get quite attached to our characters, but obviously, they are prisoners, they've committed crimes. Were you sort of conscious of balancing, that line between, well, these are criminals, they've done the wrong thing, and just in terms of how you were presenting them? Because one of the things that I love about the story and about the characters is that nothing is really black and white. There's this sort of sense that, yes, okay, they're criminals, but they're still human beings. And there is this idea that, they're in there, they're going to, at some point, most of them are going to come out of the prison system. Who are they going to be when they come out? Like, how much did all those factors play into your writing of those characters?
Enormously. My degree was in English literature and sociology, so I've always had a real passion for how humans work as a group rather than individual psychology. And I think prison is a really interesting group environment for human beings. It's not a natural environment, and so I guess you could say that you could think of a lot of different environments that were microcosms but not slightly real. So I mean, you used to be a teacher. I mean, high schools are an environment unto their own. I'm sure working on a space station is an environment unto its own. Being in the army, working in a hospital, and I think so. You kind of, in what I guess I'm saying is that in those kind of environments, you're seeing behaviour in a particular context and through a particular lens that may not be the same as if it was on the outside. So because I'm in that environment, I'm not spending my time judging them for their crimes. I'm spending time working with them on their day-to-day life kind of thing. So I didn't want to come as a narrative voice over the top of the story and go, oh, look, this is terrible. There are times, as you know, in the novel where I do talk about the crimes that are at the centre of why they are there. But I also think it's really important to understand that, and I've talked a lot about this with people who've worked in custodial capacities or teaching in jails and stuff, is that they don't even deal with the prisoners on a day-to-day basis with the big label, tattooed on the forehead kind of thing, is that you can't function like that. You actually have to deal with them as person to person. And so I just didn't, I wasn't trying to write a novel so I could tell people what I thought about, people who are murderers or, gambling addicts or whatever. I was writing a story that I wanted to use the fact that they were misfits, if you like, to put it in that context. To put them in a situation where they were doing something like sewing a dress. And having that sort of, you talk about tension and friction, there is that friction around these guys, how they're going to work together when they're not used to working together to create something, which is sort of the antithesis of how they spend the rest of their time.
Yeah, which makes for some really great reading. And of course, it's not just the men. As you mentioned, we have Debbie, who features a little bit in the story as well, of course, the bride-to-be, and Derek's ex-wife, Lorraine, who is an interesting character, and Jane, who runs the sewing circle. So maybe if you can just give us a little insight into the women in the novel.
So Jane is, she is the sewing teacher who comes into the jail every Thursday for 3 hours and runs the backtackers. So she works for the charity, Australian sewing charity called Connecting Threads, which is the equivalent of Find Sell work in the UK. So one's real, one's not. And they call their sewing groups the backtackers. And I guess that's partly to, make them more masculine sounding than a sewing circle. And she comes in every Thursday and teaches the men the fine art of stitching, and she also supervises. So as prisoners build their skills, and they're starting to then teach other prisoners who join the group. So it's a select group, so it's only 13 stitchers at any one time. So that's her job, is to come in and basically teach them stitching skills. She takes their finished work out of the prison with her. The men are paid to do the stitching, so she has to keep track of who did what and make sure they've got something to do and make sure they get paid. So she's there, if you like, to facilitate how they spend their time outside of attackers as well. So they're sewing in their cells at night, etc. Jane is a real softie in many, many ways, but she's also very stubborn, and she makes a decision in the novel which has almost dire consequences for everybody else. And that is also a wonderful source of tension, because the reader is aware of the decision and no one else is. So she was great fun. And then Debbie is as the daughter of the bride. She has not seen her father since his sentencing hearing. So she hasn't seen Derek for over 5 years. So she is very influenced by her mother's opinion of her dad, and that is not a very good opinion. And I think Debbie's a really interesting linchpin, but I don't want to give too much away, so I'm just going to leave Debbie at that.
Yeah.
But Lorraine she was so much fun to write. Lorraine and her sister Sharon, Shaz, were really good fun to write. And originally when I wrote Lorraine, she wasn't that bad. And then, I don't know, on a whim one day, I jumped on the Chat 10 Look 3 Facebook page and was like, I'm looking for wedding stories. I will steal your ideas, so don't tell me anything that you don't want me to put in a book. And I had some fantastic stories. Some of them were sent to me privately, and they were doozies, but I promised I wouldn't put it in the book. So for those ones, I was like, no, if you send it to me privately, I will not put it in the book. But what became crystal clear was that my Lorraine at that time was nowhere near as awful as some mothers had been at their daughters' weddings. So I just had to ramp her up a fair bit. And I think we'd all agree that Lorraine is appalling.
Well, she's a shocker,
but
isn't
so
she?
much fun because she's so appalling.
Yeah, at that whole mother of the bride thing, but then, just the whole background with Derek, and it makes for some really funny moments. So Meredith, the other aspect, well, I guess you mentioned before about the library and Doc, running the library and the book club and all that sort of thing, and that's connected to the library that is in the town where the prison is, sort of situated. And I know that you live in a sort of small town, rural, community. How much did your experience of living in a sort of rural community, if you like, or a small town community, how much of that did you draw on to write those aspects of the book?
I think it was a little bit more than that, to be honest. I think it was also, as you know, as a writer, one of the great joys and pleasures is to go around touring. And as a consequence, I've been to quite a lot of small town country libraries and done author talks and had in conversations. And they're just, they're so often in these adorable little old buildings that used to be the bank or used to be the town hall, or, you're in the CWA hall or whatever. And the sort of sense of connectedness that comes to the library in a small town is a very different, if you like, transaction to what it is in a big city library or a big suburban library. It is much more intimate. And so definitely there was seeing that in play on a day-to-day basis in my own library in my little town was part of that. And that, library had been under threat at one point in time. So that sort of, I guess, feeds into the story. But I guess the larger part of that was driven by what was happening in the UK again, when people might remember, particularly around 2014, 15, 16, was the British government and various councils were closing libraries across the country, and authors were coming out. And I remember Caitlin Moran being one of them in particular, coming out saying, I came from a poor working class background, the library was my refuge, and I escaped a violent family, I escaped boredom, I escaped all sorts, the only way I could get any study done was if I went to the library, and that's the only reason I'm now a professional writer, journalist, whatever the case may be. So there was quite a lot of conversation around it. I used to write about it in the Hoopla a bit as well. And so I think that was also really playing on my mind around the importance of literacy generally, and you're a reading ambassador yourself, so you know that that's something that we all talk about as writers, that what an immense privilege it is to be able to read and write. It's easy to forget. And so I really wanted to look at the literacy issue in jails from that lens, rather than banging the tabletop and going, all these poor prisoners are illiterate, tra-la-la. It's like I wanted to look at, well, what is the importance of books beyond the physical book itself, beyond the reading? And I think it is that sense of community, that sense of connectedness, which of course then ties back into another theme in the book, which is about addiction. And I draw on Johann Hari's book, Chasing the Scream, where he posits that the opposite of addiction is not sobriety, but connectedness. And that really resonates with me. And so I saw the library also talking to that idea of the opposite of addiction is connectedness.
I love that. And, as you say, there's, pardon the pun, but all these different threads in the story come together, and you do end up with this really great sort of quilt, if you like, of issues around friendship, connectedness, the addiction issue, the family issue, the relationships themselves between the men, the friendships. So was there anything, obviously you're drawing on all these things as you're writing the book, was there anything sort of unexpected that came up in the writing of the story for you?
I think this will sound really silly, but the unexpectedness wasn't the story so much as I didn't know how I was going to write a novel that had so many characters with so many voices. Not only technically, like to pull it off, as in to not have the readers head hopping like crazy and wondering who did what going on, but I really did want to create that sense of an ensemble cast, and I didn't know how to do that particularly. So fortuitously for me, I did interview Rosalie Ham about her book, The Year of the Farmer, and I asked her that directly, like, how do you do this? Like, how do you, you've got all these different characters and all this stuff is going on and there's all these different plot lines, and I had already had a lot of characters in my book, but she said, well, that's just how my brain works. I just think like that. And I was like, right. So you just kind of, basically, I suppose you just have to take that leap and trust yourself that you can actually pull that off. And it is a challenge. Like, it looks, hopefully, I'm saying it looks much easier on the page. Hopefully it does look a lot easier on the page than it is to actually do. And I think the other big surprise for me was there were some unexpected plot twists that were even unexpected to me. But when you know what it's like as a writer, you go, oh my God, that is just like, duh, why didn't I think of that before? Those kind of moments were good. And I'm quite, if you've read any of my drafts, you know that I can be quite kind of abrupt at the end of it. It's like it just finishes. It's like, and it's up to you as the reader to figure out what would happen next. And I do have writing friends that like, no, you need to sew it up more neatly, pardon the pun. And so this is my first novel where I challenged myself to tie it all up in a neat bow at the end. So that was a challenge too. So there was a bit of but the way that came about was a bit of a surprise, I suppose, is what I'm saying.
Yeah. Well, it is wrapped up in a beautiful bow. And while we're talking about that, of course, the gorgeous cover that was specially prepared for you. Can you tell us a little bit about that? Because it's just fabulous.
It's the sort of thing that when you're an aspiring writer or you're just starting out, you're like, that is so cool. Now, you can't see in the way this is framed, that on my wall over there is the Holly Ringland poster for the Lost Hours of Alice Hart.
Yeah.
And that artwork that they had commissioned, that was up there before I was with the publisher. So this is the same publisher, right? So I've just loved the artwork in that poster, and the amount of, that someone actually drew all those beautiful flowers, and then the graphic design people had all turned it into that lush cover and did all the artwork inside. I was like, wow, how lucky was Holly Ringland? And so it's kind of a bit weird for me that the same publisher turned around and said, do you know what would be really, really good? So they designed the cover, and it was just, graphic design. And then my editor comes back to me and she says, oh, well, the designer's mum's a stitcher, so they've decided they're going to stitch the cover. And I was like, what? And so she gave that image to her mum, and her mum, with a blank canvas, literally sewed that cover onto a canvas. Like, no, it wasn't, no colouring in between the lines.
Mm-hmm.
It was literally, I've seen the pictures, and I've put them up on my newsletter, but I'll probably put them up on my website once now the cover reveal's been done. So yeah, so they stitched her mum stitched all of that cover, and then they photographed the stitched cover to then create the book cover. So yeah, and then
really
it's kind of embossed a bit and stuff, isn't it? So it's pretty cool. Like, I feel incredibly privileged that anyone would go to that much effort for my book.
Oh.
Sounds really awful, but it is a very nice thing to do. And it's a bit different, as we know, it can get a bit boring with book covers when they've got stock images all the time, and that you kind of go, oh, it looks the same as, there's been a bit of a run on books with women walking down roads with hats on and suitcases and going off into the distance, and sort of, as you know yourself, that can sort of, it can get a little bit stuck in the rut with some covers. And you and I were talking earlier about how much we love the new Emily Maguire cover with the love objects. I mean, wow, that is an amazing cover. So it's really lovely to see when publishers can go out, and make something that's a work of art in and of itself, I think.
Yeah, definitely. Are you a sewer yourself, Meredith?
Yes, I am a sewer. I'm just hesitating because it's like, at the moment, I've got so many things going on. It's like, I basically get to post dinner and it's like, right, where's the bed? Take me to it. But yes, I am. I'm in the middle of doing a Strawberry Thief tapestry, which, it's actually needlepoint, it's not tapestry, which is a William Morris design. And I've got a whole lot of tapestries, also William Morris of his Artichoke series, that I've got about to get turned into throw cushions. I originally did them. This is what happens, you see, when you're a single mum for 10 years and you've got no social life, you've got a lot of time for stitching. So I recently uncovered this whole camphor box of all this stuff I'd forgotten I'd even made over the years. That child of which I'm talking, that I was a single mum for 10 years, is now 30. So you can imagine some of it's a bit old. But I found all these artichoke heart tapestries. There's 6 of them, because originally I was doing them to be drop seats into dining chairs. And so I went, oh golly. And they're not, like, tapestries are really expensive now. And so I went into the local upholsterer, who's a mate of ours, and said, can you turn them into throw cushions? And he went, absolutely. So they're going to have a second life. But yeah, I do stitch and I do knit. I'd probably say I'm a slightly better stitcher than I am a knitter. I'm self-taught because I'm left-handed, and it's really hard for anyone to teach you how to do stuff like that when you're a lefty. So it's all been out of books and stuff. But it's like I wouldn't, I'm not no wunderkind. I'm no Joey Maloney, let's put it that way.
Right, okay. But at least you could draw on your experience of stitching in describing that in the book. And of course, one of the big things that's been keeping you very busy is your work with StoryFest, which is coming up very soon. So could you tell us a little bit about that?
So StoryFest is a little festival we started down in my part of the world on the south coast of New South Wales. It's kind of already bigger than we anticipated, but it's a great team of people. It's a writers, readers festival meets film festival kind of, it's got a bit of drama going on. So it's called StoryFest because it is a storytelling festival. So that's going to be on the weekend of June the 18th to the 20th this year. Like you say, not far off. And we've got something like 40 artists coming to visit the area. So that's everything from filmmakers. We're actually going to be showing The Dressmaker and talking to Rosalie Ham and Sue Maslin, who Sue Maslin may produce the movies. Rosalie Hamp wrote the book. So I'm looking forward to that perennial conversation around which is better, the book or the movie. That'll be fun. But there's a whole lot of people, and many people that have been on your podcast as well. So there'll be some real familiar faces, some new faces, and it's just a wonderful weekend. And the locals come out in absolute droves to support it. So it does make it, like most things that you put your heart and soul into, it's exhausting, but when you get to see it happen, it's kind of like, whoa, that is so cool. So yeah, it's a bit it's in that final rush phase where it's 7 days a week trying to make sure no wheels fall off.
No, I'm sure they won't, and I'm really looking forward to it. But in the meantime, of course, your beautiful book, The Dressmakers of Yarrandarrah Prison, is going to be out in time for Mother's Day. So is it available in different formats, and where do you suggest people go to find it?
Well, it's going to be an ebook. It is an ebook. It is a print book, and it's also an audio book. And here's the thing for you: the guy who recorded the audio book messaged me on Instagram to say, I've just finished recording the audio book of your novel, and the actor who's doing the voiceover and I are both in tears. And I've never had that happen to me when I've recorded a book before. And I just wanted to tell you, and I went, wow. So I haven't heard the audio book, but I reckon that means it's probably going to be a pretty good audio book.
Yeah.
How exciting. So it's available in those 3 formats, and it's available all over the place in all the usual places that people buy their books and audio books and stuff. So yeah, not long. And as you say, Mother's Day.
Yeah.
So definitely good feel-good fiction for Mother's Day.
Definitely. Well, congratulations on it, Meredith. It's a fabulous book, and I know it's going to just strike so many chords with people when they get out there and start to read it. So well done, and I can't wait to see it out in the public domain and with people sitting on trains and buses now, hopefully, post-COVID, well, almost post-COVID, and listening to the audiobook.
Oh, look, exactly. Look, and that's the exciting bit, isn't it? As a writer, it's like starting to hear the reaction and whether people, how the book makes people feel. So I am excited that it's going to be out in the world. I am really keen to hear what people have to say and what resonates with people. And that's all that's when it has, it's sort of like you release it into the world and you see, if it flies and how it flies. It's an exciting time. So yeah. I really do hope people, get hold of it and enjoy it and have a great ride with it.
Yeah. And if people want to find out more about you and your other books, Meredith, where's the best place to find that online?
Well, pretty easy. If you go to my website at meredithjaffé.com, you'll find me there with all sorts of comments, and there's readers' notes going up and stuff as well for people who are interested for book club. I've written 12 questions as well, so there'll be heaps of support material too if people want to really delve into the book. So all on the website.
Great. Well, I'm going to be seeing you very soon at the launch of the book. And and also then at StoryFest. So thank you for joining us today on the Convo Couch, and all the best with it.
Thank you so much for having me, Pam, and thank you for everyone who's listening in today.